Hello, good evening, and welcome to Deep Roots New Branches. I am so excited for tonight's conversation. We have with us tonight Reggie Mobley. Before I do a proper introduction, I want to just thank Early Music Seattle for sponsoring this series. Deep Roots New Branches is all about stepping back and taking a broader view of what early music is and what it could be. And we're excited to be in conversation with Reggie tonight about Reggie, about the work that you have done, obviously in the field of early music, however we want to define that, which we'll talk about later. But also the connections that you've been able to make between different musical traditions and musical techniques that are able to transcend from one body of work to another, from one century to another. And we'll be looking at issues around equity in our field and how we work towards that. As always, conversation is a big part of this series, and so we welcome comments and questions through the chat, and say hello to everyone who's joining us via the live stream at Early Music Seattle's website, via Facebook, and we look forward to your questions. Just drop them in, and we will integrate those as we go. Um, and now it's my pleasure to introduce Reggie Mobley to tonight's gathering. Probably needs no introduction. We're so excited to welcome you, Reggie, to Seattle. I know you just got in last night and probably fighting a little bit of jet lag. Um, and we're thrilled that you're here to do a program um, with Early Music Seattle this weekend. And as I understand, you'll be filming a program that will be edited and shown later, as well as doing a live program on Sunday. Um, and it is just a thrill to be able to be in conversation with you and to connect with you with regard to your very much celebrated work in the conventional field of early music. But for me, as someone who straddles between early music and various types of folkloric music and world music, and basically music that's anchored in our cultural communities, I'm really excited to chat with you about the work that you've been doing to really open up our thinking in terms of how we perceive what early music is and how we make connections between different traditions of music. So thank you so much for being here and for coming and hanging out in Seattle for a little while.
Thanks. You rolled out all the sunshine for me, so I'm really happy about that. So that's great.
We will take it, especially in January in Seattle. Like seasonal depression disorder is a thing.
It's
Um,
warmer than Boston though, so I'll also take that. So we're all good.
yep, yep. There's a reason why these northern cities are so infatuated with coffee, right? I mean, and as I think as I remember, you have a signature drink, actually, don't you?
I mean, it's not so much a signature as just an intense amount or volume. It's 10 shots of espresso over ice, which is it's I mean, it's just a number. It's just espresso. Just
Just a little cafecito, just to
yeah,
get you going.
just more than any other person would perhaps drink in one sitting, but that's just me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Keeps me human.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and yeah, you'll have no problem connecting with coffee in Seattle. So we should be in good shape. And I'm excited to talk about, maybe get a little bit of preview of the program that you've been planning with Early Music Seattle. I also want to celebrate the Grammy nomination with Agave Baroque and hear some of that music. But also, I want to dig deep a little bit on kind of your musical formation and a favorite question, which I'm just going to plant now. We're not going to talk about it, but I'm going to plant it so you can think about it. Is what is on the Reggie Mobley mixtape, or your Spotify list. Basically, not necessarily your own music, but the music that is like that defines your musical development, that defines your story, or is music that you go back to that font for inspiration. So we'll come back to that later in the program, but I'm super curious to hear what is on that mixtape. Uh,
Sorry, you're gonna hate it.
well, I'm excited to find out, no matter what. So, and I'm sure I'm gonna love it. But um, if it's okay, maybe we start it before we start our conversation. Would it be okay if I share a recording of one of your performances?
Please,
I think I have two on tap. Do you have a preference for which one we would start out with?
dealer's choice.
Okay. All right. So we will start off with this is something from uh, Agave Baroque, and this video is titled Dream Faces. Is there anything you'd like to share about it before we get it rolling?
Not particularly. It's a little song by Justin Holland, who is a guitarist in the 19th century and also a social activist in his own right, or abolitionist, really, I guess is what you'd call them at that point. But he was very accomplished and sadly kind of forgotten by, mainstream classical music, especially in America within the 20th century. But we're hoping to really kind of make people aware of him, and not just him, but other composers of color who existed before the 20th century. So this is just a really lovely little song between myself and Kevin Cooper, who's playing guitar. And it's almost like a 19th century American lute song in a way. Hope you enjoy it.
Awesome. Thank you. And just bringing that up to share. Bravo. Thank you. Thank you. And so tell me a little bit about how you all came across this composer, and you were sharing a little bit about the work to spotlight this composer and perhaps other composers um, in this vein. How did you first encounter the composer, and what has some of the research entailed?
That's mostly through through Kevin Cooper, who's the guitarist and lutenist, theorist, plucker for Agave. And he's always known of Justin Holland. I mean, I guess he's kind of one of the treasures, kind of lives within the guitar world. And he kind of shared that with us. I mean, he was very well known for having transcribed operas and operatic music for the guitar. He was apparently this crazy virtuoso. I lived in Boston for a while, moved to Mexico and learned guitar there in the 19th century, and then came back and just began this great career as a performer, as a musician, and also as a composer. And so many of his sonatas and etudes and variations and so forth still kind of cycle around, the guitar repertoire world, but his songs never really kind of made escape velocity. But because of this, this collaboration between myself and Agave, there just happened to be a chance where he was able to bring that to the table when we started programming this album. Mm-hmm. And I'm really happy for it. Really, really happy for it.
Yeah, yeah, and it gives me pause too to think about just the work in general of spotlighting composers that have not been given attention, or also spotlighting entire bodies of work, and I think there is some momentum to that now. Those of us who have worked on these topics for many years are kind of like, wow, sea change. All of a sudden there is some attention that is given to these overlooked repertoires, whether they are repertoire, whether it's of a particular cultural community or specific individuals. How is this kind of figuring into your work right now? As I knowing that it's something that you have been working to make connections across different traditions of music, and now there's this kind of momentum around it at this moment. How is that figuring into your work that you're doing in different projects in different places?
Well, I'm honestly just seeing what I can gather and seeing what fits where. I'm kind of in the glutton phase where I'm trying to take in as much as I possibly can. It's this massive gang of hungry hippos where I'm just like, anything I see or anything I hear, I'm just kind of gathering and hoarding. And then once, I kind of feel like I have enough or I have something to work with, then the various places where I the groups and ensembles that I work with and projects that I have planned, then I see what fits where, see if this round peg fits in this round, this round hole, and square peg fits this square hole and things like that, and are just seeing if maybe there's something I have that may be useful to someone else who's also doing this sort of work. It's not just about, I don't want my name on things. I don't care about being the guy that introduced the world to, to Salas or Florence Price or anything like that. I just want to make sure that this music is being heard. And if there's someone with a bigger voice or someone who's in a different area that I'm not, that can use this more than me, by all means, please take it, please use it. Like we should be sharing this. Like, it's not about, your own legacy as a musician or a scholar or anything like that. It's about sharing this incredible music that incredible people wrote, that we should hear and share, and for any given, not just because it's beautiful music and because it's art, but because, in the case of composers of color, this music connects people of color, to music in general. Finding out and realizing that, oh, there was this composer here in the 19th century in America, or there's this composer in England in the 18th century. I realized that people that look like me have always been a part of classical music and early music. There's still that perception that we're kind of a guess, that we're black and brown bodies in white spaces, and that we will, that we don't really belong, and that we're just kind of being allowed. But the truth is, and I say this all the time, we've always had a seat at the table. It's just someone else is sitting in it. And so, through this work, through sharing and bringing awareness to composers like Holland and Price and Lusitano and Nunez Garcia, we can now take responsibility. We can now have some onus. We can now have a stake, a claim. We can say that this is our music too. And so that's part of my goal with some of this.
That is, yeah. I mean, I'm like goosebumps because this, I think, speaks directly to what so many of us have experienced. And you really hit it on the head. That idea of like, that. Are we guests here, or do we have a legacy here? And that idea of being seen not only in the moment but in the historical record, and that idea of the fact that we've been here and we've made contributions, and also that we're not invisible. And I'm thinking, as you were talking, I'm thinking back to experiences even in school, in K-12, where our communities sometimes were next to invisible in the history books. It's like, well, where are we in the story of these great accomplishments? And it's not that we weren't there. It's a question of how it was portrayed, how it's framed, and the perspective from which it is presented, right? And yeah, so no, I was just going to say it's very powerful, and it's good medicine for us too, to think about how that our legacy is there, and that sometimes it was direct through specific composers, sometimes it was through influence of composers being influenced from different parts of the world, as with my focus on the Americas. We actually a few months ago did a program on music and dance of the African diaspora in the Americas, and looking at how that's its own body, but also it had a tremendous influence on the direction that music took in Europe for centuries and continues to this day. And so on so many levels, it's exciting to uncover some of those personalities, those composers, and those musicians, as well as those trends and the kind of unnamed creative labor that is part of the picture.
That's great.
Right.
I mean, that's when you said that we were there. That makes me think it's like it's so important to realize that not we weren't just there, but that we had our in many cases we had our own agency in regards to that as well. We weren't just, like when you think about how we're taught about, speaking of K through 12, how we're taught about the Civil War, and it's always like they're talking about McClellan, and they're talking about Grant and Lee and Beauregard, and there's always a sense of, oh well, of course you were there, but you were unimportant. You had this other role that we were kind of, we were doing the adult stuff to do something, to make sure that you had something. And that's just that idea that that's not the case. Chevalier de Saint George, he was nobility. Ignatius Sancho was a shop owner and the first Black person to vote in parliamentary elections in the UK. Like we weren't just there, but we had our own voices and our own minds about things. I mean, things weren't as great and there weren't a lot of us, but we were there.
Yeah, yeah. And no, I mean, and I just think of example after example in the ways that, going back to guitar music, the jacaras and canarios, and how these different forms that are bread and butter of quote unquote early music have a direct connection to Iberians being influenced by West African musical concepts in the Americas, and so yeah, there's on so many levels, as you say, we were there, and we were in the conversation. We were not necessarily like the supporting cast, yeah, and in the choir,
yes, exactly.
chorus line, and so talking about the places where we were, and we were there historically. I also want to talk about the places that we've been individually, and I want to kind of jump over to the idea of musical formation, because part of that idea of not being invisible is also acknowledging that there is more than one way. There's if you put in a destination in Google Maps, there's more than one way to get to that destination. And I have been so struck. One thing that you and I have in common is that we both grew up doing music at our faith communities as young people, and that's perhaps just one aspect. But I want to kind of roll back to like the little Reggie chapters, and and talk about before you were doing formal musical study at the collegiate level and beyond, at the conservatory level. Let's talk about some of your first influences musically, but also creatively, because as I understand, you have approached creativity through multiple lenses, through visual art. And as I said when we were getting ready for this conversation, DC is on the table for conversation tonight. So comics, church music, how I'm very curious just to hear how all these things kind of assembled into the Reggie story.
Well, I did start, my earliest memories of music were in my church choir. I was born and raised in Gainesville, Florida, and I was born into the Seventh-day Adventist faith. But as with, all things, there was, even despite how anyone may feel about religion, about Protestant religion, and especially Adventism, in the South, in Florida, there was still kind of a racial barrier. You were always going to find two Adventist churches in any town, any city where Adventists existed. There was always a church that was predominantly white, and there'd be a church that was predominantly Black. And obviously I was in the latter. There were actually two separate conferences altogether. But this church was more in the style of what you would expect from a Southern Black Protestant church, like Methodist or Baptist. And so I grew up singing in the little cherub chorus and church choir. And so it was from an early age that I kind of saw and understood and made that connection that music was a part of faith. And also growing up Black in the South, I understood that music was also part of culture. Like there were so many times where I saw that, we didn't really have that many hymnals, but everyone knew the words to every song. And if you didn't really know the melody, you were harmonizing. And it was just always this incredible cacophony of sound and harmony and music and rejoicing. There was almost more singing than speaking, in these services for us. Of course, the pastor would go on till everyone was starving, but outside of that one guy, there was just always music, and it I guess it stuck with me. When I was old enough to decide that I didn't want to sing in the church choir anymore, I stopped, and did what a kid in the 80s would do, and that was focus on Transformers. And that's all I cared about. And eventually, around the age of 8, I took some piano lessons from the church organist, just to learn, and then stopped back for a couple of years, and then didn't think about music at all. Like it was all about art and toys and whatever I saw on screen, which was usually Doctor Who or Star Trek or something like that. And it was in middle school that you were given an option for 3 extracurricular activities. You could join the sports club, the computer club, or band. And I wanted to join the computer club, but this kid I had a crush on joined the band. And so I joined the band, and he played trumpet, so I picked up the trumpet. And so 6th grade, I picked up the trumpet. And it was in that first year, we did our first concert. We played Kokomo, Baby Elephant Walk, Wipeout, and this band transcription of a Bach prelude in C. And everyone was obsessed with Wipeout. Everyone was obsessed with Baby Elephant Walk and Kokomo, but I was completely just enraptured by this music that I heard. I'd never really heard or knew Bach before, but the moment we started playing the fugue, there was just something that just struck me. And from that point forward, every time I got a chance, I'd go to the public library and check out every possible CD and cassette I could of Bach or Handel or anything that just looked classical. And I just absorbed that. And I did that kind of alone in my room because I was raised with my grandparents, and my grandmother, she hated classical music. She thought she called it funny music because that was the music that white people listened to. She really only allowed in the house like gospel and jazz and music like that. And so those 2 things kind of became my one universe after a while. Like I didn't see the difference between Bach and Dizzy Gillespie and Ella Fitzgerald and whatever Michael Chance or Andrea Scholl. Like it was all just music to me. But after middle school, I thought I would put music away, and I started focusing more on art. My high school was a magnet school for drafting and architecture, and I was in that program. And it was later on in my high school career that the chorus teacher, my senior year actually, the chorus teacher really needed boys. She needed men. She needed tenors and basses to sing. And so my brother sang in the chorus. And so she said, if one Mobley can sing, surely the other can sing as well. And so she grabbed me, took into her office, and had me sing a scale, just like, that's good enough, we're getting you in the chorus. And I kind of fell in love with it. I fell in love with singing all over again, because she was reintroducing me to Bach and Purcell and these composers that I'd heard, earlier in middle school. And at that point, I really decided that I love music more than art. So at the time, I had a scholarship to a college in North Carolina for graphic arts. And my mother and myself and the course teacher and guidance counselor, we kind of put our heads together, and I applied last minute to Oakwood College in Huntsville, Alabama, which is an HBCU and is also affiliated with the Adventist Church. Well, I don't know how or why, but they decided to match my scholarship for music. And so my freshman year of college, I went to Oakwood College as a trumpet performance major, and I didn't touch the trumpet a single day. I immediately switched to voice and started taking voice lessons and sang bass too in the college choir. And after a while, I went back to Florida, to Gainesville, went to University of Florida, where I took lessons with John LaFond, who, at that time I was trying to be a tenor, and it was him who decided that, well, actually, you might not be a tenor, you actually might be a countertenor. He heard me singing some alto lines, or actually some high tenor lines in barbershop quartet I sang in at the time. And then he had me take the switch, and all of a sudden, here I am singing countertenor and right back in Baroque music. Like I just keep coming back to it. And at this point, yeah, I never left it again. I haven't left it since.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm there's a couple things, and first of all, I have to share. I started on trumpet as well, so another
Awesome.
little kid playing trumpet. But um, I'm thinking about a couple things you just said. One is kind of this moment of discovery of like, oh, tenor or countertenor, right? And also the other thing that you said, that you were singing barbershop quartet, and I'm also connecting this with, the home that you said you grew up, you would check out these CDs of Bach and Handel, but what your grandmother had playing in the house was jazz and gospel. Um, so at what point did you start to veer specifically towards, I really want to look at early music and kind of, Baroque and early classical music versus another genre? At what point did you decide that was where you wanted your focus to be?
I'm not sure when or how that may have happened, but I think it was just um, there was a familiarity with it. There seemed to be a connection that I understood, that made sense, that no other genre within classical music did. I honestly, if I think about it, it would have been 1992. There was this Quincy Jones produced album called Soulful Celebration, and it was basically, if you've heard it, it's all these Black artists um, reinterpreting parts of Handel's Messiah, and I was completely like, there was nothing better. And 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 after basically wearing that cassette out, I said, well, maybe I saw that it handles that name is on other things. And so I went to the library and found just an actual recording of Messiah. And so I checked that out and listened to it, and I was like, oh, 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 that's wonderful. Like that just it makes sense. And so I checked out other recordings and then would be completely baffled by the idea that, well, it's the same music, but it's down half a step, or he's not singing the same notes this person's saying, or this, it's a completely different voice type. And I kind of began to notice that there was this sense of freedom and improvisation and allowance of expression that more modern styles didn't have. And that, of course, made perfect sense to me growing up in gospel and jazz, which is also allows you quite a bit of freedom of expression. And so I saw the kinship between the two. And at that point, I haven't seen a reason to look back.
Yeah, and I think you zeroed in on something really vital there, that I think people don't always make that connection. Hopefully, they're making the connection more now. Is that idea that there are these parallels, this in some ways common spirit between, what we classify as European early music and gospel and jazz, and that idea of that uh, how could we say, like, holding simultaneously both structure and improvised ornamentation. And both of these, what would seem to be very different bodies of music, have that commonality. um, and I'm curious how that has informed, your own practice, in terms of, borrowing from one to inform the other, and how it's, whether it's something technical or stylistic that has allowed you to kind of, move freely between those two spaces?
I think honestly, having had such exposure to gospel, growing up in gospel and jazz, um, kind of set me on the right course for feeling comfortable with improvisation and ornamentation in Baroque music, and just how Baroque music is now kind of being performed. There's I kind of my own personal philosophy, whether it's right or wrong, but it's mine. Um, I I don't think of the early music genre as a genre as much as I almost think of it as a movement or kind of a revolution. Like I feel like I the way I've seen it is that it's kind of come as a rejection to kind of the staid, paint by number, very kind of, you know, um, strict form, practice and forms of classical music and how it's kind of been interpreted at this point. And because of that, I don't think of early music as a continuation of the 17th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, but it's its own genre within itself. And as its own genre that started in the 60s and 70s, it's a movement, it's a style that's now younger than jazz. Jazz is the older brother of early music, as far as I'm concerned, because we will never know or hear with the ears or understand what this music sounded like. Like, we have treatises and we have kind of, you know, arrows that point us to how things should be performed and how things should be done. But ultimately, it's kind of a fool's errand to try and recreate something that would have no bearing or kind of relevance, our importance to people now. The point of it now is this music that we're seeing was so much closer to the people. This wasn't the music of these god conductors who just sat and sipped tea and got consumption. I mean, these were craftsmen. These were practical musicians who used this music for very practical reasons. And it all has relevance to who we are and what we are now. There is so many things that Monteverdi and Rossi and Lotti and Bach and Handel said that really can really speak to the things that we're feeling and going through now in a much more personal level. And because of that, I feel that looking at jazz in some ways can help us to make this music more alive and more relevant than it was before. Like, think of the way that Ella Fitzgerald sings a chart. She doesn't care about this consistent spin or tone. She uses her voice to service the music. It's so onomatopoeic, it's so Madrigalian. She sings a word how it sounds. She puts herself into it, and she does not at any point let her become the most important thing in the room. She understands that she's a conduit. And I think as musicians, especially in early music, that's a lesson that we can and should learn. We should be able to look at a Purcell song and kind of look past whatever we think of that music being, and see that there is a sense of swing, there is a sense of relationship, there's a sense of humor, in this music. With Bach as well, he's not this fifth evangelist on a marble pedestal. He was a man who liked to drink. He was a man who had a lot of kids and was a focal point when other, musicians and literati came to Leipzig. Like, here was a man who enjoyed life and understood the human element, I think, more than most composers at that period, and even some now.
Yeah, so much of what you're saying is resonating in terms of like the primacy of musical interpretation in the early and Baroque eras and in jazz, and how we approach early music today. That idea, it's almost like we can almost invert things, flip the coin, right, and say, instead of from our point of view, oftentimes, especially in conventional conservatory trained music, it's like classical is the touchstone, and then everything else is like in relation to classical. But what if we back up and we look at early and Baroque music, which had this tradition of, ornamentation and improvisation. And then we see the classical almost as like a speed bump of like total fixation on, music as text, right? And recreating specifically. It's almost like it, then all of a sudden it's the thing that's a little bit different, right? And the early and Baroque music and jazz and even hip hop for that matter is becomes like this music that it balances a little bit more that idea of loyalty to the source, but also that sense of musical choice that the artist has to make, as you say, and some do that more, with more ego than others. Whereas you just said like, Ella, is a conduit. She is reading the musical moment and applying, it's like the cook in the kitchen who's applying the spices that are needed at that moment. Um, and so it's, to me, it's interesting, to this idea to kind of, just flip it around from, so that classical music isn't the anchor point, but that these other traditions are the anchor point.
Yeah.
Along those lines, as I understand, you have also been doing some work. It's speaking of flipping things around. I know that in researching for tonight slash cyber stalking you, I was learning a little bit about the work that you've done in terms of, you know, how does spirituals fit into early music? And I almost want to flip that around where, where the debate has been, almost like a question like, can we count spirituals as early music? I almost want to say spirituals are early music and prove me wrong, like, what if we flip our premise there and say, not argue to be included, but to argue to say it is a valid, part of, this body of work. And, if you don't agree, then, prove me wrong, uh, can you tell me a little bit about your work with spirituals and how you've been, just what you've been doing to kind of connect these two worlds of conventional European rooted early music and a more inclusive vision of other traditions such as spirituals?
Well, I mean, part of that is we have to kind of reject the idea that white, our Western classical, is the default. That's the only and the best and the true music that existed at any time throughout time. That's not true. There was music in Japan and China. There was music in the Americas, despite what was going on in Europe at the time. And so, if we think of things that way, just by virtue of things having, music having existed at the same time, of course it's early music. Spirituals were being written, created, and sung at the same time that Handel was writing and Mozart was writing, and not only chronologically does that place a lot of this music at the same time in that same period, but as far as American music goes, it is the earliest music that we kind of think of in the United States as our music, as American music, and an original form at that. I mean, Dvorak saw it, McDowell saw it, Delia saw it, and they were obsessed with it. Why aren't we? Why aren't we, really celebrating the roots of everything that we know now? We can't, we do, and we have, but without the music of Black and Brown people, we wouldn't have the Sarabande. We wouldn't have had Dvorak's Ninth Symphony. There's so much that exists that we think of as just by the virtue of the brain of these God conductors or composers. No, the world around them influenced them, and we know that now, and we just need to accept that now. Yeah, I mean, that's why I reject the idea of even the term ethnomusicology. I don't like that otherizes the music of people of cultures that aren't specifically Western European, and I think that's something we need to stop. We need to kind of reset our way of thinking about about music and cultures and the world in general, and realize that we are a part of a larger whole, and that what was going on here was as important to them as it is to us. Because we wrote the books and wrote the narrative, of course, we set our perspective that way, but we know more now. And if we know more, it's on us for not acting and really kind of moving to accept and live with our knowledge and our wisdom that we have through hindsight.
Yeah, I mean, amen. That is so resonant with a lot of things we've talked about in the Deep Roots New Branches series. I mean, we've talked about, the impact of the golden age of Islam and Sephardic Jewish poetry and North African, musical practices on, shaping European troubadours and so on. And you brought up the saraband, which is another wonderful example um, of kind of a kind of cultural baton being passed right through musical practice. Um, and I really appreciate what you're saying too in terms of like how do we look at music in a context, and it really is a shift because so many of us in our schooling even particularly in musical schooling, it is like, okay, well, this is what early music sounded like. It was like Greek lyres, and then it was Gregorian chant, and then it was, and that's like one slice, right? That's like taking a core sample. That's like going to the tundra, and there's all this earth, and you take one core sample, and then you say, this is the story of everything, right? It's just one vertical sample of this whole rich sediment, right? That's piled up over ages, and so I think it's really exciting to look at um, how we can broaden this picture, and I think spirituals in particular tell such an amazing story because it is a story of a community like in dialogue with its situation, with its challenges, with other cultures, and it's got it's got tonalities that connect us to West Africa, but it's got other elements, including the language, that connect us to Europe, and so I mean it's just so beautiful. It makes me think about what do we want to open up in our field in the future? I mean, I know that you've been doing a lot of work in equity overall, but what are you excited to see open up and blossom in our field as we kind of take these steps towards a broader, more inclusive vision?
I want to see us open up and hopefully normalize from the majority of the classical community, to not just get the mainstream classical, I guess, us to recognize spirituals and gospel and actually other genres with it, at this time, but also early music as well, to kind of really reach out and accept it all as valid, and having its own thing to say and being of equal standing. That's something that I really do kind of hope for. I'm trying to think of another way of answering your question, but I'm getting kind of COVID brain just a bit right now.
That's
Sorry.
that's okay. I'll ask it in another way too. So like let's say what would you like to see from early music organizations that produce and program early music? How would you like to see these organizations embody what we've been talking about tonight in terms of how they program um, artists that they book, ways that they connect with audiences? What are some of the things that are top on your list for that?
I do want to see us really kind of dig more into diverse musicians and composers that existed, to really to not just focus on who we've always focused on, but to really give a lot more attention to composers like Lusitano and Chevy de Saint George and Nunez Garcia and Exasio and Isabel Leonarda and Cotzla, to really kind of embrace the diversity that was there, because it has such a strong relevance to who we are now. I would like to see us really kind of embrace music like spirituals and early music from the Americas and Africa, and understand that it in its time is also valid. And perhaps we'll see exactly that there's a lot more that exists in Western European music that comes from elsewhere. Like, I would really love us to accept that. And I would love us to kind of focus on that. I want to see funding going to scholars, you know, I want to see papers and things written on the spiritual in relationship to the music around us in the in the general world. I want to see us not there's just so much elitism that's still existing in early music. And I remember at one point I was getting ready for a concert of queer composers, and I included Handel and Schubert. And I remember there was someone who commented on Facebook, says, a musicologist, who said, well, why does that matter? That's not important. That's not what's important about the music. And it's like, actually, it very much is. A composer, musician's identity isn't just important and influences who they are and how they behave and work and write, but it's also eminently relevant to people of those cultures and those groups that exist now. We cannot deny that the people that are performing and listening now have to be able to relate to what's going on. Music can't exist for music's sake. For me, it has to have a purpose. It has to do something. It just can't be entertainment. It can't just be art. It has to be, there has to be an aspect of service with this. This is music ultimately, at the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned, is the blueprint of who we are as a culture, as a civilization, as a species, how we work. It's what we should be going for, as far as progressing as people. I feel like music has the answer to so much of that. And if we deny any bit of who we are or who we were musically and how it should and can relate to us now, then I think we're just, we're missing the mark and setting ourselves back a bit.
Yeah, and gosh, we could talk for a very long time about this. There was actually a question. Gus was on the same page as us, and asked a question. For organizations that are programming, what would a concert program, what would an evening look like that was practicing some of the values we're talking about right now?
Well, often now, in so many cases, a few of the recitals I've done over the past year that have been mostly early music or classical music, I actually start with a spiritual, because if I think of spiritual as early music, then I need to practice what I preach. I will start with My Lord, What a Morning, and then go into something, a personal song that I feel that follows the same theme of what was in that spiritual or that song. I think doing something like that, like really kind of just mixing things in. We don't have to just do. We can, even if you want to focus on one period, there's a lot more music outside of Germany and France that we can bring into this conversation. And the other thing, the thing about that I think is very important, is if you are uncomfortable programming a spiritual in your early music program, because you're looking like, well, we're all just middle class, white people, then ask the question as to why that's the case. And then once you start to really kind of broach that subject, then maybe we're ready to talk about things. But I think the programming is of just doing it and finding the relationship between other music that we've kind of ignored for so long is helpful to start.
I think there is a moral imperative in there too. When you talked about, you just mentioned, well, if you're resistant, why are you resisting? And that's not to say, okay, well, you're racist, although that could be, there are those possibilities in the universe, but it also, I think there's it brings up a lot of questions with equity in terms of arts dollars as well. When you think about a lot of the mainline classical organizations that in major cities have access to tourism dollars, for example, which are the larger dollars, and a lot of the cultural communities are they're relegated to the small 2 to 10K grant, and they're all competing with each other for that. And to the extent that some of these anchor arts organizations can take on this work, hire the artists and the scholars that can lead this work, and even perhaps even offer PD for their resident artists, to become more versed in it. It can be a very powerful thing. Um, and I think that what you said in terms of practicing what you preach is also very powerful, because as a headliner you have that ability to insist on what a program might include. um, One other thing that I want to talk about, in the time that we have remaining, and just remind folks that if you do have a last minute question, go ahead and drop it in the chat, and we'll be happy to get to it. Um, how do we resonate with audiences? Because I think the other thing is like, for major arts organizations and classical music organizations that do receive public dollars, we have to look at our cities and our communities and realize, oh, in some cases there is we now have a majority of color when you aggregate all the different communities. And so that's kind of where I get back to that idea of a moral imperative of, like, if you're receiving public dollars, that you need to connect with all segments of your all demographic segments, not just the one that's been most comfortable with you. Um, what are your thoughts in terms of how we connect with I'll say new audiences because they're new to these organizations, but I never like using that term new audience, because they're not new, they've just been there, they just haven't been connected. So whether we say historically underconnected audiences, or however we might phrase it, what thoughts do you have on how we not only change our repertoire, but how we transform our audiences to make things more accessible?
Um, my point of view is be vulnerable, go to them, and don't patronize them. I've we've been taught so long that like, as we've talked about before throughout this conversation, that we've been made to feel as though we're outsiders to this art, into this music. And even though we say that the gate is now unlocked, the gate is still closed. We don't know that it's unlocked. It's important for us to open the gate and reach out and bring people in. And I think one way of doing that is really going to them. Bring what we think is important to them to them. Don't ask people of color, people who live in Roxbury or live in Dorchester to come to Symphony Hall, to come to Back Bay. No, we go to them and bring this there. We bring these dollars to those neighborhoods that need it. We bring what we think is important in these neighborhoods and bring it and show them, and also introduce them to music they didn't know that they're a part of. To do a concert of Florence Price and Amy Beach all together, not saying we're doing a Black concert and so we're gonna do it in the Black neighborhood. No, we're doing a concert that includes the diaspora, that includes the everyone, and we want to present it here because we think these communities, these areas, you've been ignored for too long. Arts and culture doesn't belong to downtown, doesn't belong to the nicer, more affluent areas of town. It belongs to the whole community. We move forward together, again, always. It's instead of going to the usual venue in church, in a nice area of town, why don't we try making those relationships with Black churches? Some of them have the same acoustic, have the same space, have the same parking, and it introduces our usual subscribers, our usual audience members, to the people that are their neighbor. And it creates that sense of equity, that it creates that sense of understanding and opens your perspective to who else is sharing this town, this community, this world with you. And that's really important. And also when I said be vulnerable, this isn't always going to work on the first time. I think people may take that to heart and say, you know what, I'm going to go to this AME church and I'm going to say, hey, can we rent your space for perhaps less than we rent the space in the white part of town? And they say, no, we don't know who you are, please go away. Or, it's like, no, we're not really interested in that. Don't take that as okay, well, we tried, now back to, this, our usual spaces. Keep trying. There's a lot of distrust and skepticism that's been built up over 400 plus years. You have to work to build that relationship, and you have to keep trying. And at some point, when you show them and they understand and realize that you are honestly trying to make a difference, they'll be more open, they'll be more receptive, and you'll find that they will be more excited about what you offer than the people that have always had it. It's what you were saying earlier about the idea that the aggregate is now a color. Boston is a minority majority. It's minority majority city now. It's 53% color, and that's a lot of dollars that aren't and a lot of butts and seats that aren't being focused onto us and what we have to offer. So it's important to just realize that we need them as well, as much as we think they need us.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's really powerful because there's in that message there's a message of humility, and in humility that allows us to grow. Um, and and I think that is something that's really exciting for, as you mentioned, early music in some ways, while it's, some of the sources are ancient, the field is young, it's a baby, right? And so how do we grow it from here? How do we cultivate it? And in what direction do we want it to grow? Um, I think these are tremendous questions, and I really appreciate the time that you've taken tonight to be in conversation and talk about some challenging things. And we didn't talk about your mixtape per se, although I got some hints when you were talking about some of the things you'd check out and some of the things you'd hear. But can you just hit us with like a mixture of what would be on your kind of the Reggie Mobley biographical mixtape?
Well, there would definitely be that soulful celebration. There'd of course be a lot of Bach, but there'd be Dizzy Gillespie. There would also be some Japanese rap groups. There would also be Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross. Like, I love vocalese. Like, you'll hear a little bit of everything. There might even be some of the Transformers soundtrack on that mixtape. But it's whatever I'm feeling at the moment, and it's kind of just a bit of everything.
Well, I think that's a good way to send us off is to be open to a little bit of everything, and how can we grow when we are in dialogue with those around us, and something I think that's really important for our field. It's so great to see the way that you bring that into practice with your concertizing and with your activity in issues of advocacy and equity at the national level. Thank you so much. I've seen some comments from folks here. Olusegun is reiterating that sense of unity that's so important. Hearing from a friend in Sacred Music, we connected through Sacred Music Publishing, Lori Krupp. Thank you for being here. Nancy, thank you so much for being here. And of course, thank you to Gus and Amy and everyone at Early Music Seattle for supporting these opportunities to ask some difficult questions and to also celebrate, just the kind of complicated beauty of it all. And what it means to lean into it. And I love what I've heard you say it before, and you mentioned it tonight. There's no paint by number here. we're challenged to approach this with our creativity and our our humility and sense of learning. So thank you so much, Reggie. We're very excited to host you here in Seattle this weekend and look forward to that program. Congratulate you on the Grammy nomination. Anything else that you want to share with folks?
No, just come to the concert, and if you don't, go to someone else's concert. But just go.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone. We'll see you next time.